for joining us today, and I will turn things over to Sarah Rosier.
Hey, everybody. So my name is Sarah Rosier. I'm the news editor at Ballotpedia, and today we just wanted to give an overview of what happened. We're hearing a lot of the hot takes and the pundits discussing the election. What we wanted to do on this webinar is go over what this means, how it fits into some historical context about midterm elections, and then really get down to the nitty-gritty about the ballot measures. So we're hearing what happened in the Senate. We know Democrats took the House, but then there were these state level elections and these ballot measures that can often have more importance on a citizen's everyday life than who your state senator is. So let's get into it. One thing I wanted to discuss first was with Rob Oldham. He's our elections marquee staff writer, and he earlier in the year set forth to look into what a wave would be this year. We started hearing virtually the day after the inauguration that 2018 could be a blue wave. And so Rob, can you give everybody a brief explanation on what a true wave historically is and explain this report that Ballotpedia released earlier this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ballotpedia wanted to set an objective benchmark for what would constitute a wave in 2018. And we wanted to base this definition on past election results. So we looked at 100 years of data for House, Senate, gubernatorial, and state legislative races, and we identified the 20% of elections where the president's party lost the most seats in each election type as waves. And so we set that 20th percentile election, which would be 48 House seats, 7 Senate seats, 7 gubernatorial seats, and 494 state legislative seats, as the thresholds of seats that Democrats would need to gain or Republicans would need to lose for there to be waves in 2018.
All right, that takes us then to what happened on Tuesday. Was there a wave in 2018?
So the answer is obviously varied. The House, close but no. The Senate, no. Gubernatorial races, very close but no. And state legislative races, probably not. So I'll go through those piece by piece. First, the House. So Democrats obviously took the House, but as of now, it does not look like they are going to have flipped 48 Republican seats, which would have been the minimum to classify the House as a wave under our definition. My guess is that they probably take around 35 seats, which is high by historical standards because the average number of seats that the president's party typically loses in midterms is 29 seats, but it's not quite a wave. You probably know that the Democrats did not pick up seats in the Senate. In fact, it looks like they're going to lose 2 or 3 seats once elections in Arizona, Florida, and Mississippi are finalized. So a 2 or 3 seat gain for Republicans actually qualifies them for the opposite of a wave. And this is something that we call a presidential wave. So that's the 20% of elections where the president's party did the best in the last 100 years, rather than where they did the worst. But while the Democrats did lose seats in the Senate, they did pretty well in state gubernatorial races. It looks like they're going to net 6 seats, which is just 1 shy of the 7 seats they needed for 2018 to qualify as a wave. And kind of part of the reason why we see such a divergence in Senate and gubernatorial statewide results is that 10 of the Senate Democrats who are running for re-election were in states that Trump won in 2016, while on the governor's side, 26 of the 36 governor's races were Republican-held seats, and 13 of those were open seats without incumbents. And as for state legislatures, we really just aren't sure yet because we don't have the final numbers for how many seats flipped. Democrats needed 494 state leg seats across the 2017 and 2018 elections. Yes, there were the Virginia and New Jersey elections in 2017 that everyone seems to have forgotten about now. And so we haven't crunched the final numbers yet, looking at the results of both of those elections and the 2018 elections. It looks like Democrats probably won around 350 seats last night, so that would leave them, about 150 seats short of a wave. But again, we don't have the final numbers, and so a call on a wave will come later.
I love that you just said last night because I've been thinking it's Wednesday all day too. So, so it is Thursday.
It's been a blur, I'll tell you.
It still feels like Tuesday at around 2 a.m. to me.
Maybe
So-
because I didn't go to sleep Tuesday night. That could be part of the reason.
Exactly. Thanks, Rob, for that. So let's look at the federal election results really closely right now. We're still, like you mentioned, some of these are still coming in. I know we just got a call in Georgia 6 this morning. What happened in the U.S. House? Where are we right now?
So yes, these numbers are updated for the Georgia 6 call. Democrats have flipped 34 Republican seats, and Republicans have flipped 3 Democratic seats, which gives us a net gain of 31 for Democrats, which is, of course, 8 more than the 23 that they needed to take the House. So again, not all races are called, and it looks like there could be up to 5 more seats that Democrats could potentially win. 23 of the losers last night were Republican incumbents, while no Democratic incumbents lost. And just kind of looking at that comparatively, in 2016, we had 7 incumbents that lost, and in 2014, 12 incumbents lost. So the 23 last night was pretty significant over the course of the last 3 election cycles.
Yeah, there were a few significant. I mean, we saw a lot of retiring incumbents this year, a lot more than normal. So yeah, a lot of interesting shifts in the House, and there will be quite a few new freshman members in January. What were some of those noteworthy races last night? If you had to really target into which races attracted your attention. Sorry, I just said last night. On Tuesday night, how would you describe those?
Yeah, we'll figure out the day of the week eventually. Maybe once we get some more sleep this weekend. I would say the ones that I was particularly interested in were the seats that were held by Republicans, but Hillary Clinton won them in 2016. So far it looks like the Democrats actually won 16 of the 25 Republican seats that Clinton won, and probably when all the votes are counted in California and Washington, they're going to pick up at least 2 more. So some of these seats were ones where the incumbents had retired, like you said, and they were open. That includes Darrell Iss's seat in San Diego, California, and David Reichert's seat on the outskirts of Seattle, Washington. And then some of these other seats were where the incumbents ran, for example, Peter Roskam in the Chicago suburbs of Illinois, and Leonard Lance in the kind of suburban New Jersey outside of New York City. So again, you can see just from my description of those races, a lot of these races were in the suburbs of major cities, and a lot of them did not, they kind of repeated what they did in 2016, where they did not vote for Trump, even though they went Republican in the past.
Fascinating, yeah. What about the U.S. Senate? So I know for me, as we started watching those returns come in on Tuesday night, the Senate tone was set pretty quickly by Donnelly's loss and those votes coming in there. What else happened throughout the night? I mean, it does seem to contrast with the big gains Democrats had in the House. So where are we at with the Senate?
Yeah, so that kind of speaks to the fact that the election seemed to play out on 2 very different maps. So on the House side, you had this suburban districts that weren't too hot on Trump in 2016. And on the Senate side, at least the 3 flips that we know were Indiana, Missouri, and North Dakota. And all of these seats voted for Trump by major margins in 2016. We're talking, about 20 points for each. It looks like Republicans have probably won Florida as well, which was a more narrow win for Trump in 2016. So that's maybe a little bit of a deviation from that trend. On the Democratic side, they flipped Nevada, which voted for Clinton actually in 2016, and they are still holding out hope in Arizona, where Kirsten Sinema, the Democratic candidate, is currently losing to Martha McSally, but they're still, as I understand, about 650,000 ballots to be counted. So we're still waiting there. 2 other districts or states where incumbents won that I wanted to point to were West Virginia and Montana. These were very strong Trump states in 2016, and both Democratic incumbents, which was Joe Manchin in West Virginia and John Tester in Montana, they both won re-election. And I think that kind of shows that personal brands in states, regardless of partisanship, can still be pretty strong. Like if you know anything about Manchin or Tester, you know that Manchin is a West Virginia candidate and Tester is very much a Montana candidate. So those were two that were pretty interesting to me. So overall, we saw 5 incumbent losses in 2016. That's more than we saw, we saw 5 incumbent losses in 2018. That's more than we saw in 2016, where we had 2 Republican incumbents and loss. And it's about in line what we saw in 2014, where 5 Democratic incumbents lost. And once we find out what happened in Arizona, and we have a runoff in Mississippi in late November, and we'll know a little bit more about the Senate after that.
Yeah, it could be a few weeks until we have a full number for partisan control in January. All right, now let's move on to state results. So one of my favorite topics is government trifectas. So what a government trifecta is at the state level is it's when one party is in control of the governor's mansion, the state house or the state assembly, and the state senate. This happens fairly frequently. It's a recent phenomenon. Back in 2010, I believe only half of states had either a Republican or a Democratic trifecta. But more recently, Republicans have been doing very well at the state level. So post 2016, there were 26 Republican trifectas, meaning over half of the states had Republicans in control of the 3 branches that I just mentioned: state house, state senate, and governor. There were only 8 Democratic trifectas and 16 were divided government, meaning in some way or another, the state legislature and the governors were split, or the state house and the state senate. Not all 3 parts were in control of the same party. What happened to Democratic trifectas on election night? Did that follow more with the House, or how did that shake out?
So Democrats had a pretty good night as far as trifectas goes. They picked up 6 new ones, actually. That was Colorado, Illinois, Maine, Nevada, New Mexico, and New York. And they won the governor's race in all 6 of those states, and they also won the state legislatures. Some of them, such as Colorado, Maine, they flipped some previously Republican chambers. They also broke 4 Republican trifectas. They won the governor's race in Kansas, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and they won the New Hampshire state legislature. Georgia's gubernatorial race isn't called yet, so they have a chance there as well, although it's looking like Kemp might, who's the Republican candidate, he's going to eke that one out. So in addition to what they did in terms of picking up trifectas and breaking Republican trifectas, Democrats also protected 5 of their own vulnerable trifectas. So this included tough governor's races in Oregon and Rhode Island, where Democratic incumbents were able to beat back some pretty strong Republican challenges. And they also held the Senate in Washington and in Delaware, where they had some pretty thin margins. And I know at least in Washington, they expanded their majority. In Delaware, I don't think we're quite sure about what the results are, but we know the Democrats will hold the chamber. Another interesting one was Connecticut. And so this was a race where Democrats had a trifecta, but they had slim margins in the state house and the state senate. And the governor, Dan Malloy, had very low approval ratings. So, we were considering the possibility at Ballotpedia that Connecticut might flip from a Democratic trifecta completely to a Republican trifecta. But it looks like Democrats were able to win the governor's race and both state legislative chambers there. So overall, they are going to improve from 8 to 14 trifectas.
What about Republicans?
So as I mentioned, Republicans lost 4 trifectas in Kansas, Michigan, New Hampshire, and Wisconsin, and they could also see Georgia go as well, although that might not be happening. They also likely picked up a trifecta in Alaska. So they won the governor's race, which was held by an independent, and it looks like they're going to have a majority in the state house, which actually does have a tendency to form coalition governments that sometimes can put the minority in charge. For example, Republicans won the majority of seats in 2016, but a Democratic coalition ended up coming to power. So, we'll hold off on Alaska, but for now it looks like Republicans are going to have a trifecta there. So overall, they're going to go from 26 trifectas down to 23 trifectas and maybe 22 depending on the Georgia results. And so that's going to give us 22 to 23 Republican trifectas, 14 Democratic trifectas, and 13 to 14 divided governments. So a pretty different landscape than the 26 Republican trifectas, 8 Democratic trifectas, and 16 divided governments that we had going into the election.
Fascinating. So what does this mean? One thing that we noticed at Ballotpedia was that nationwide fundraisers, some of the pundits, they were looking more at state than we'd ever noticed in the past. So at Ballotpedia, we just go nerdy over some of these state elections, but sometimes we are looking for other people to be interested and it's just not there. But this year, everybody has been looking at what's going on in the legislatures. And a big reason for that is redistricting. We saw Eric Holder and his group and his network of fundraisers want to look at how Democrats can make gains in the state legislatures in order to impact this redistricting that's going to happen within the next 4 years because of the new census. What does the idea of trifecta government and the partisan control of these states mean for 2020 redistricting?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sarah, because a lot of the governors and even some of the state legislators that are elected to 4-year terms, we know that they will have a seat at the table for redistricting. So that's really important for a state like Georgia, where, you know, if the governor's office goes to a Democrat, then we know that there will be at least one Democrat will be at the table for redistricting after 2020. So yeah, trifectas are really important because a trifecta means that one party controls the process, while a divided government means that both participate. Josh is going to talk more about some of the changes to redistricting that we saw through ballot measures, but we know that as of today, there are 34 states where state legislatures draw congressional lines. So of the 16 states that do not, we have 7 Democratic trifectas, 6 Republican trifectas, and 3 divided governments. So that means that if nothing changes in 2020, we're going to have 16 or 17 Republican trifectas drawing congressional lines, 7 Democratic trifectas drawing congressional lines, and 10 to 11 divided governments drawing congressional lines. So, you know, that's pretty significant for what the makeup of Congress is going to look like throughout the next decade.
Thanks, Rob. Really appreciate that overview. And like you mentioned, redistricting was also a big topic in some statewide ballot measures this year. And also with us today is Josh Altic. He is our ballot measures expert, and he's going to discuss some of these bigger topics that were the theme of some of the overarching ballot measures that made up the marquee measures this year. So we're going to talk about first redistricting, because Rob gave us such a nice segue, and that was a topic this year. Then we're going to briefly chat about marijuana, election policy, Medicaid expansion, and if we have some time, we're going to throw in some housing and taxes discussion. So we're going to cover all the life bases here. But first, Josh, talk a little bit about what we saw on the ballot dealing with redistricting and how that ties into this redistricting theme of 2018.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Good morning. So Rob mentioned that number of 34 states with legislative control over redistricting, and that number is going to be lower than it was going into 2018 because of these ballot measures. So in Colorado and Michigan, we've seen voters overwhelmingly support independent redistricting commissions for both state legislative and congressional redistricting. So those measures, one of them, Michigan, was a citizen initiative put on the ballot through a petition. In Colorado, the legislature voted to put Amendment Y and Amendment Z on the ballot, but there was sort of pressure from various initiative efforts prior to that. In Utah, we're still waiting to call that. It's a very, very narrow race, about a 0.5 percentage point lead for Utah's independent redistricting commission measure. We'll see sort of whether or not that is approved as well. And then in Missouri, voters came out to really support by over 12 points an initiative that sort of creates a really unique system for redistricting at the state legislative level, rather than not the congressional level. So that would create the first ever state demographer as an individual who's tasked with drawing maps those maps then go to an already established political commission for approval, but need a supermajority approval. And if they don't get that for the map, then the state demographer's map sort of just goes into effect. And then there are some more unique criteria in that measure for the maps themselves. All these measures, Utah, Colorado, Michigan, Missouri, included some sort of more traditional criteria, such as contiguous boundaries and not splitting up counties and cities. But Missouri's had some specific formulas for what it defines as competitiveness and partisan fairness that need to be followed when drawing up these maps. So that's a kind of a unique and novel system there. So with these four, if Utah's passes, then that's going to kind of definitely change the landscape of redistricting in these states after 2020. And then earlier in the year, Ohio voters passed an initiative to basically enact supermajority requirements and partisan vote requirements on their redistricting process for congressional districts. So all in all, I see 5 states, at least 4, and maybe 5 states that could have very different processes, not controlled by one party or the other, regardless of trifecta status.
Yeah, the one thing I noticed, Josh sent out this great little roundup early on Wednesday morning when some of these first measures had started coming in. And one factoid that I found particularly interesting is that Michigan is the first state east of the Mississippi to look into these independent redistricting commissions and to pass something like that. Do you have any thoughts, Josh, as to, is it just kind of I just found it interesting that the breakdown of geography on these independent redistricting commissions was such that Michigan is the first more eastern state to do so.
Yeah, and you'll see a theme with Michigan being sort of the first in the Midwest for some of these policies, including recreational marijuana legalization in a minute. But that also shares the trend that on the West Coast, these policies were more popular and were enacted. So with redistricting, all of the commissions that are independent rather than political, that are in control of redistricting, sort of lie on the West Coast or in the West. And it's I guess I would point to just maybe the more progressive nature of those states in many ways, and the initiative process is more in use in those states, and some of those commissions did come into being through the initiative process. So it's hard to say exactly why there's sort of been that barrier that hasn't been crossed yet. And it seems to me that 2018 was a sort of a good year to break that barrier, because there's a lot of motivation with the 2020 census coming up, a lot of tension surrounding elections and district maps, a lot of maybe dissatisfaction that was tapped into among voters regarding elections. So it makes sense that barrier was broken in 2018, but it's hard to say exactly why it hadn't happened earlier.
Fascinating. Yeah, and perfect transition to marijuana and Michigan's relation with that too. There's clearly a lights out year in that state for these marquee ballot measures. Tell us what happened across the country with some of these marijuana measures.
Yeah, so there were 2 states voting on recreational marijuana legalization, kind of a slowdown from 2016, which was probably one of the biggest years for that movement. I think that the population more than tripled in states that had legalized recreational marijuana, but still none in the Midwest. So Michigan represents sort of a break into the Midwest for the recreational marijuana movement. The other state voting on recreational was North Dakota, where that measure failed. So kind of drawing the line there, Michigan, of course, was a pivot state, voting Democrat, then Republican, while North Dakota voted Republican in the last 3 elections. But I think Michigan passing marijuana is significant because it could mean we see more of these later. This is encouraging to anyone planning a marijuana legalization measure in a state like Missouri, which passed medical this year, or Montana, or even Ohio, which there's already an effort going on to get an Ohio initiative on the ballot in 2019. So I think overall, Michigan passing is encouraging to marijuana, and we're going to see sort of the use of the initiative process to seek marijuana legalization continue, maybe if at a slightly slower rate, rather kind of avoiding some of the most conservative states, at least until they have some sort of evidence that they can get support there. The measures were very different as well, so it wasn't just that the state's political climate was quite different. North Dakota's measure was kind of an open book for the legislature. It did not provide a tax rate. It did not provide any sort of maximum possession limits or any of the regulations you see that have been sort of enacted in most of these recreational marijuana legalization measures, sort of targeting a similar to alcohol type attitude. North Dakota has just left it entirely open to the legislature. Michigan did have some of those more traditional regulations. But yeah, so with medical, Missouri and Utah voted on medical marijuana. Oklahoma approved it earlier this year. But as far as Tuesday night goes, Missouri approved one of 3 measures that were on the ballot for Missouri. And I think there was a little bit of dread both for journalists and for us trying to explain it, that all 3 measures might pass. So Missouri voters proved more selective and approved Amendment 2 and defeated Amendment 3 and Proposition C. Amendment 2 could be characterized as sort of a middle ground for a lot of the key provisions for medical marijuana. It had a 4% tax rate as opposed to 2 under Proposition C and 15 under Amendment 3. It had home grow provisions that were more specific. It had possession limits that were kind of in the middle. And it also had a more traditional allocation of revenue as opposed to something like Amendment 3, which created a pretty novel, or would have created a pretty novel commission to run the revenue allocation for that too. So anyway, they approved one, defeated the other 2, becoming the 32nd state to legalize marijuana. Utah, we haven't called that yet. It's leading right now, but the results aren't all in for Utah. If results continue kind of in this trend, though, it's likely to pass, and that would give us our 33rd state.
There was some funny quote, I think, was it Orrin Hatch who said, it's just really funny. You look at Utah, and again, it's kind of like this Michigan thing of states you wouldn't necessarily expect to be at the forefront of some of this policy, but Utah were accepting coffee and alcohol and now marijuana. So I wish I had that direct quote in front of me, but it's kind of funny. All right, now let's look at election policy. So this one has been at the top of my mind because when I have been researching what would be on Maryland's November election ballot, which is where I live, we had one of these election policy amendments that did end up passing on Tuesday night. So tell us, break down some of the different types of policy regarding how elections are handled, voter registration. Talk to us about this election policy ballot measures.
Yeah, Maryland passed same-day voter registration. So yeah, this is one of the most common trends if you try to look at grouping measures under certain topics. It's just elections policy, and redistricting is sort of lumped in there as well. Probably the measure that got the most attention this year in this area was Amendment 4 in Florida, which was approved by about 4 points above the 60% requirement. So it's a 64% approval there. That measure is so interesting because it could have a pretty strong impact on future elections. The measure restores voting rights automatically to felony convicts once they've served their sentence. And there's an exclusion for murder and for certain felony sexual assaults, sexual offenses. So that the numbers we have are not certain, but it's looking like there's somewhere between 1.5 to 1.75 million people who are now going to be eligible to vote automatically. So that's a big influx of newly eligible voters in a state that's notorious for razor thin margins, like you saw with this election as well, with the recount going on and pretty narrow victory for Republicans in some races. In fact, DeSantis opposed this measure so that he was going to seat, but then have to sort of deal with it and see if there is sort of an effect of this coming out in future elections. The exact effect is a pretty unknown quantity at this point. But no one thinks there will be no effect, and so we're looking to sort of follow that closer and see how it turns out going forward. But yeah, so all eyes were on Florida. Lots of other states were addressing just elections policy and voter access as well. You saw things like automatic voter registration through an initiative pass in Nevada. Arkansas and North Carolina both approved voter ID amendments put on the ballot by the legislature. And then a pretty unique initiative in Michigan Proposal 3 was approved, and that put a pretty large list of voting policies into the state constitution, including straight ticket voting, automatic voter registration, and same-day voter registration, and no excuse absentee voting. And these are just sort of the top of the list. There were a bunch of other ones. In North Dakota, there was an initiative to sort of set citizenship as a legal minimum for voting rather than a maximum. It changed the constitution from saying every citizen has a right to vote to only citizens have a right to vote. Currently, there was no direct effect on either state or local law, but sort of another example of an issue that was in some cases kind of polarizing, that was put on the ballot through an initiative concerning these election policies.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, that Florida 4, at Ballotpedia, part of my role is just tracking attention on different measures and where the page views, where readers are going to on our site. And that Florida Amendment 4 was one of the biggest, most attracted pages on the site. It was trafficked very heavily. Readers were just interested in it, and it garnered this nationwide attention that sometimes election policy doesn't necessarily get. So that was very interesting to track, and then see how the result, like Josh said, contrasted with the Senate result and the governor's result. So we'll see what happens there in the next few months, especially with the shakeup of power at the state level there too. Medicaid, that's kind of a perennial topic. Tell us what happened on the ballot this year.
Yeah, I mean, healthcare in general was, I think, one of the more energizing topics for voters this year. While you say it's perennial, it's actually a frontier for the initiative world. 2017 in Maine was the very first initiative to expand Medicaid coverage ever, and that passed. And the Medicaid expansion movement had a pretty good election night. They were on the ballot in some more red states, and they won three out of four. And the fourth one in Montana had some details. So let's go into it a little more. The issue at stake is whether to expand coverage to 138% of the federal poverty line under Obamacare. Going into the election, 17 states had not expanded, and most of those were because of either opposition from a governor or in a red state where there was opposition from the legislature as well to expansion. And then at the ballot, there were two topics being addressed. One of them was whether or not to expand coverage. The other was how to fund the state's portion of coverage, which is increasing kind of incrementally. So that those were the two issues sort of being discussed in two of the measures. Idaho and Nebraska were simply about expanding coverage to that 138% benchmark, and those passed sort of more easily than the other two. In Montana, you see it failed. In Utah, the mechanism that was attached to expansion was a sales tax increase, and that measure, we haven't called it yet, but it is leading, and we kind of expect it to pass. I think it was leading by between 3 and 5 points. In Montana, the mechanism for funding was a tobacco tax increase, which brought in a lot of opposition money. I think there was over 17 million spent in opposition to that measure, which kind of dwarfed any kind of opposition for the other three. There was, I don't think any of the other three broke $1 million in opposition campaign spending. So kind of a different scenario, and Montana voters ended up rejecting that by several points. I think 3.5 or 4 points. And in Montana, you may know that Montana was one of the states that had already expanded Medicaid coverage going into the election. But their expansion policy included an automatic sunset date for June 2019. So with the rejection of Initiative 185 in Montana, that sunset date is still in effect. So barring another initiative or some sort of legislative action, you could see a state going from expanded coverage to unexpanded coverage, which would be very new as well, in the second half of 2019. So those are the Medicaid expansion measures. There's still 17 minus the 3. There's still 14, over a dozen states out there that have not expanded Medicaid coverage, and among those, 6 still have some sort of process for citizen-initiated measures. So I guess the results from Tuesday are encouraging to that movement. It still looks like a policy that voters are inclined to approve, just with the information we have so far. So I could see that being an issue kind of that goes onto the ballot again, maybe even in Montana. So looking at healthcare really briefly outside of Medicaid issues, specifically, California Proposition 8 was defeated. It was the most expensive measure this year. It would have created profit limits or revenue limits for dialysis companies in California at the 115 mark. And that one, yeah, like I said, it was the opposition spending is what pushed that to be the most expensive measure this year, with over 111 million spent in opposition, specifically by some of the larger dialysis companies in California. And then in Massachusetts, voters rejected question 1, which is a similar conflict between a union and sort of an industry. The Massachusetts Nurses Association put question 1 on the ballot to provide nurse-patient limits. And that one received some opposition. I think it wasn't as much of a David and Goliath story as Proposition 8, but certainly the opposition outspent support by 2 to 3 to 1. And that measure was defeated.
Yeah, that was another big one this year. A lot of attention drawn to that, and pretty big margins though when the results came in. We have a few minutes left, and so I wanted to ask Josh just about some boutique topics, housing and taxes. But before that, if you do have any questions, I believe this is streaming live on Facebook too, so feel free to type in your questions in the comment section there. But if you have any questions for either Josh or Rob, please type them into your Zoom webinar, and we'll do our best at the very end to just answer them. Anything that you've heard about today, if you have any specifics, just let us know. So real quick, Josh, housing. We saw some measures in California. We saw one in Oregon. Give us a brief rundown of what housing related measures there were.
Yeah, so the second most expensive measure this year was Proposition 10, which would have sort of given local control of rent control back to local governments. It would have repealed the Costa-Hawkins Rent Control Act. That one was a brainchild of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which was also behind sort of the drug price measures in 2016, and has sort of garnered a reputation for taking on an industry. And it was rejected after I think opposition outspent it by 3 to 1. Then in California, Proposition 5, well, let's talk about Proposition 1 and 2 first. Propositions 1 and 2 were approved. Proposition 1 was a $4 billion housing bond, and that was approved. And then in Oregon, Measure 102 was a measure to kind of allow certain federal tax breaks to be applied to affordable housing funded by local municipal bonds. So currently the law in Oregon doesn't allow any sort of private ownership of affordable housing created through funding from a municipal bond issue. So this sort of removed that and provided an exception for it, specifically for affordable housing, allowing sort of partnership on that local level for affordable housing. As we're running out of time, I'm just going to move on to taxes real quick. The one of the trends this year, kind of one of the more conservative trends in ballot issues was restrictions on taxes. So these came in lots of different forms. One of them being enacting supermajority requirements for approval, asking for voter approval on future taxes, or banning certain types of local or statewide taxes. So one of the biggest ones got a lot of attention was California Proposition 6, that would have repealed a gas tax from 2017 and required voter approval for future gas taxes, and that was defeated by voters. And then in Florida, voters approved a supermajority requirement for future taxes, a 2/3 supermajority requirement. Oregon and Washington both voted on bans for grocery taxes. And California was headed that direction, but a compromise sort of headed off the initiative that had qualified for the ballot in California. So voters in Oregon rejected the initiative, and Washington was leading by 55 to 45%, but the mail-in ballot situation in Washington means we haven't called that for sure yet, but it looks trending to pass. There were also some tax caps on the ballot. North Carolina voters approved an income tax cap, and Florida voters also approved a property homestead tax cap.
Great, thanks, Josh. We had one question from Alan, who is attending via Zoom. He wants you to talk a little bit about the Arizona and Washington ballot measures to expand the renewable energy. Those also did attract some attention and I think quite a bit of money too. What does that tell us about support for renewables? They poll high, this is still coming from Alan, they poll very high nationally, but these measures failed when there was a lot of spending by big oil. In what states could you see a carbon tax being approved?
That's a great question. Yeah, a lot of eyes were on Washington for its sort of first ever carbon fee initiative. That measure broke campaign finance records in Washington, at least that we have available to us after 2008, with opposition spending 2.5 times more, 2.5 to 3 times more. So yeah, that was a very interesting measure to look at. Washington already voted on a carbon tax. This measure would have been a fee, and they voted on a carbon tax in 2016 and rejected it by 9 points. They're sort of rejecting this measure by about 6 points this year. There are some key differences, including the fact that 2016's was supposed to be revenue neutral through a tax decrease, while this one actually provided a large chunk of revenue for certain environmental projects. And then there are 2 measures, Arizona and Nevada, both designed to increase the requirement for renewable sources for electric utilities. The Nevada measure passed, but that's not the end of that story because it will be on the ballot in 2020. In Nevada, initiated constitutional amendments have to be approved twice. So in Arizona, where it would have actually gone into effect, it was defeated after breaking the top 10 for most expensive races. I mean, the first thing that jumps out to me is just that these fall under the trend of the side with more money winning, especially in these cases where there are a lot of money spent. If you have a lot of money, it gives you an advantage. That's sort of one of the stories of this election. But the other is that there is a concern among voters about the economy. So when you're able to message a really strong sort of pro-economy message using a lot of funds to get that message broadcasted like very highly, then that has a strong effect. I mean, you saw that in Colorado with Proposition 112, which going into the election was a bit of a wild card, but ended up failing significantly, and that was also kind of due to this pro-economy message that was being sent out. So I think that's part of it. Arizona, that makes a little bit more sense. There's it became a very partisan issue in Arizona, but in the other states, in Colorado and in Washington, I would say that the combination of resources to send out your message and then that pro-economy message. As far as what state could pass this carbon fee, I think it largely depends on how much opposition you get. So it really would totally depend on what the provisions of the measure are specifically. I mean, the measure in 2016 in Washington, which went down by like I said, 9 points, that didn't even receive support from some of the environmental groups. And that was trying to go sort of a little bit more middle of the road by seeking revenue neutrality. So I guess I don't know. I think the main problem is they haven't found the right recipe yet for the initiative to avoid the huge amount of opposition from the oil and gas industry, and while retaining the requisite support from the more progressive groups that would back this. So I think it is possible in some states. Clearly, like you said, the polling for that issue kind of shows that, but they haven't found the right recipe yet.
Great, thanks, Josh. All right, well, that's all we have for today. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. You can reach out to us on Twitter at Ballotpedia, at our editor email account, editor@ballotpedia.org, or just contact one of us through the Zoom registration that you received. So thanks so much. Have a great day and enjoy the end of election week 2018.